Welcome to the Whole Steward, the holistic approach to wealth from a Christian worldview. I'm your host, Andrew Stanton, and I'm glad you've joined. Whereas the public square previously was the platform of audible discourse, and books were the visual medium, the last 100 years has seen a rapid development in our mediums of communication. Our guest today helps us understand the history of media and the role you and I play in that landscape. Today on The Whole Steward. Well, this is episode number 47. I'm so thankful you've joined. Thank you for listening. And as you might imagine, this is a fascinating topic to me because I was one who was a very slow adopter of new forms of media. I would listen to the radio, but even that is a new form of media in the last 100 years, for example. Now we've seen the advent of not only radio, but video and audio over electronic means that has blown out of the water the old style of, say, a public discourse in the public square. If you wanted to debate in the arena of ideas, you would go down to the public square and you would listen to the people who are talking there. That's where the debates would happen. And now that happens right from our living room or from our car or from wherever we are. I used to avoid things like social media and the public presence on these electronic platforms because of the sheer fact that the speed at which information flows now is unparalleled. But I got to a certain point where I kind of decided that it was unavoidable. If you want to be completely under the radar in terms of your privacy, you can do that to a certain extent. But now with the advent of media the way it is and electronic forms of that media, information flows very quickly and it's very hard to control, even if you want to control it yourself. So rather than trying to avoid it, I started to embrace it. And that's a journey that I've taken. And here I am before you in a podcast. So our guest today is a very special guest. He's the guy who helped me set up my podcast to a certain extent, a very strong believer, and has had a massive impact in terms of media out in the world, and of course has a very unique perspective on media coming from a Christian worldview. You can see the battle of information happening right now, and I'm not discrediting that books and printed media don't play a very important role, because they certainly do, but the flow of information, if you want to publish a book about a particular topic, it takes some time to get that done. Whereas somebody can go on social media or onto a video form of media on the internet, be broadcast across the world within milliseconds. It is incredible how somebody may be in the public square debating somebody else, and these conversations are happening on an individual basis. But if somebody happens to have their iPhone out, is taking a video of that conversation, let's say they happen to be live on Facebook or YouTube or even post it, later that afternoon, that conversation could be literally heard across the world. It could go viral that quickly. And those ideas, those platforms, everything you say needs to be taken very carefully. And then we see right now the world is at war in terms of both the war in Ukraine and also the war in Israel and Gaza and Palestine. You see a battle of information. You see a big push from both sides to perpetrate propaganda. And of course, it's in written form, but mostly that's being read on our computers and laptops. Now you see this world debate. Here's a couple of examples. If you just look at the Israel and Hamas information war, you can see it's a worldwide war of words. Not only are people physically affected and losing their lives, but the battle for information about which side is right, which side is morally justified. From a biblical worldview, we go back to the text. We are men and women of the book, as they would say. We need to filter everything through that biblical lens. And I don't have time to get into this topic, but it's an example of information and the flow of information at this level. Now, you can also see, as we've seen in the past, big political and massive media movements, even with Elon Musk taking over Twitter, for example, and it's still in the public debate. So companies are pulling ads from X, Disney, Apple, IBM, and more. The business model of these platforms, as you would think about it, is funded by advertising. And this is a big deal when a company like X, formerly Twitter, starts losing massive amounts of advertising revenue. It's a big deal. And so everybody's battling for eyeballs, and Twitter is supposed to be sort of that public square, if you will, but every company that props up the business model, if you will, the advertising funding, has opinions as well. And they don't want their ads next to certain types of information. And so we'll see what happens with a company like X and whether they can survive this. Maybe they go to some sort of subscription. I know they've already done that a little bit, but we're talking about billions of dollars here. Finally, I want to just set our mind straight. As I was talking about, the battle for words, the information overload, if you will, is all about what is being said, what is true, what isn't true. And it's very hard to decipher now. Now, as we think about this topic from a Christian worldview, we need to remember that our words matter. And it doesn't really matter what the medium is that those words go out on, whether it's in written form or verbal form in a one-on-one conversation or on the global scene. If it goes into the electronics, you can count on it becoming completely public. And we need to be careful what we say. James chapter 3 is a great example of that. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. If we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also, the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above. but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So as we think about our use of media, let's bear in mind what God says about taming our tongues and the wisdom that comes from above, which is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. That's how we should be as Christians. As we explore this topic of media, I hope you enjoy my conversation with our very special guest next on The Whole Steward. Our next guest has been in media since 1980. Mainly in radio, and even doing a daily network show for Westwood One on about 100 stations coast to coast over the course of a decade. He was a weatherman and writer on multiple different TV stations in Los Angeles and anchor and commentator in Salt Lake City. He worked in a recording studio as a voiceover chief, sound engineer, and with musicians and singers on jingles and album projects. For Spotify, he narrated the entire Bible as a daily podcast, having about 15 million plays. Now, he is the self-described hub of podcastaccess.com, where he helps new podcasters learn the business and coaches established shows to more success. Welcome to the show, Andy Waits.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. Appreciate it.
It's pretty exciting to see everything that you've done and be able to have this time with you to just learn more about media and sort of the podcast producing business. You helped me actually launch this podcast not too long ago, and I really appreciate that. So it's great to have you.
Well, it's just wonderful to be here, and I like what you've done with the show. I like what you've done with the studio. You've really come a long way. You've done so much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So let's just get started. And what do you find in here, maybe sort of the highlights or one of the most interesting points in this vast career, that which, by the way, is longer than I've been alive in media. So I find that pretty amazing.
I think I just got another gray hair.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, working in stations in tiny towns, in medium-sized cities, in big metropolitan areas, and even a national network, I've learned something different at each of the different steps, because in a small town, you might think you don't get a chance to do that much. The opposite is true. You have to wear a lot of different hats. And so somebody has to learn to do those things. So rather than jump right to the big time, I was thankful. I have a lot of friends that did do that, and they've done well in their business, but in their life and their career. But thankfully for me, this has made me sort of a Swiss Army knife of media, so that I can do more different things. I can achieve lots of different things, because I've had to write, I've had to produce, I've had to work with clients, I've had to be the guy on the air, I've done promotion, I've done all the various things that need to be done.
You've probably also seen a development of technology over the years. I'm trying to think. In 1980, okay, now wait, did they have computers? Like what were you?
I did my radio show by carrier pigeon. Actually, I played records, 45s, vinyl, on a lot of our songs, at least, especially the brand new ones. And then we were playing off of, we'd put the songs when they were more popular. We'd put them on these, looked like the 8 tracks, but it was a 4-track tape. It was called a cart short for cartridge. And we would play them off of those. And those went out about, the late 80s, and we got CDs. And then CDs left in the early to mid 90s, when computers took their place. And then in the soon the computers took the place of guys like me. So a lot of us were out of work or working. One guy can take the place of a lot of different people. In fact, I kind of felt bad about that whenever I was working at the network, because I would work in Los Angeles. And as you indicated, I was for 11 years, I worked on about 100 stations coast to coast. And that means there are 99 guys that don't have jobs because I'm there in their town on the air instead.
Interesting. Now, just for my understanding, when you say you're on that many stations, is it one station that you were working for that then pipes the audio stream to all the other stations and airs on it? Or are you actually like the employee of all 100 stations? Or how did that even
I worked for
work?
a company called Westwood One. It's a syndicator. And we would put everything up on the satellite. And they would download it via dishes outside their stations and then air it live. So, and it amazed me that I could say something into a microphone and it went through all of our processing equipment back to master control where I was, in Los Angeles, and would go shoot out of our satellite dish up to a satellite in the sky. They would download it from the satellite wherever they were, from Florida to Washington State to Maine to Southern California, wherever, and all in between in the fruited plain. And then go through all of their equipment, through their board, up their tower, out their tower, into a car driving down some country road in the middle of nowhere, into their antenna. It would convert it into stuff that would come out of their speakers. All of it took about that fast. Yeah. It just blows me away.
Yeah. And that was at what point in the 1990s, or was that happening even like in the 80s? Like, how far does all that complex technology go?
That began in the late 80s.
Okay.
But my time there was 96 to 2007.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I know there's all kinds of electronics and technology that go on behind the scenes. And you mentioned, it was kind of a displacer a little bit to many guys' jobs. Mm-hmm. So it would be interesting to hear about, like, I know for a fact, because I've heard you behind a microphone flip into radio voice, and you're so good at it. And it's like, whoa, he sounds like he's on the radio, but he's standing right here. Having to adjust what you were doing as the industry changed over. And I think it would be fun to track that all the way out to today. Now, podcasts being a thing, and here we are sitting in, this little studio that, you can put together on your own, basically. So maybe kind of track that. Like, so how did you adjust through the years, and then we can bring it up to today.
Well, let me describe how broadcasting changed from when I got into it in 1980, which by that point it was a full flower. I mean, it was really doing its thing. Well, let's go back a little bit, actually. Let's start at the beginning of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were Nickelodeons. That was pretty much it. And then we had Marconi come along, and he created the radio. He invented radio. Okay. And then commercial radio started in 20? I believe it was KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And then that's commercial radio when it first started. But, who was listening? Like 3 guys maybe? And then it grew pretty quickly. So by the 1930s, we had these networks that began. And soon after that, the networks began to grow, and they hired people like Bob Hope, who, by the way, interestingly, Desi Arnaz was his band leader on his show. And they would have a studio, and people would come in and play live. When I was a kid in the 1960s, I always thought, for instance, Donny Osmond and the Osmond brothers were going to the station and staying up all night long and singing songs and playing songs. I thought how come he could stay awake later? Well, he's a little older, but it wasn't really happening like that. But I skipped a little era there. Television came along in the late 1940s, but did not supplant radio. Radio continued and grew on its own parallel course, right? Mm-hmm. They're both doing a similar thing, but differently. By the 1950s, television was becoming more and more commercial, and it kind of paralleled radio in a lot of different ways. We had, in fact, shows that were on radio that were now transferring to television, and some vice versa. Candid Camera began on the radio as a microphone. and then it went to television.
Interesting.
For instance,
It kind of reminds me of, and I only hear stories about it, but there was a really famous debate, and I forget. I think it was between Reagan and somebody else.
I think you're thinking of Nixon and Kennedy.
Maybe Nixon and Kennedy. They said that those who listened to it on the radio, I think it was the Republican, they were like, oh, he hands down won the debate.
Yes.
And then the other one was on television. Everybody watching on television said, oh, the other guy won the debate.
When you've got JFK, who's this great looking guy, he's got a wonderful tan.
Okay.
He's young, he's vibrant. He looked fantastic. And he had Nixon, who had a 5 o'clock shadow, was sweating,
Okay.
was pale, and he shifty eyed. He's looking all over the place. So, but he had command of the facts.
Right.
So if you're listening, that's what you heard. If you were watching, you saw this young, vibrant buck, John F. Kennedy, just clean as clock, how it looked.
Interesting.
So to continue the progression of media,
Right.
Into the 1960s, we began the top 40 era with a couple of different stations. One in California, it was called Drake Chenault. Those were the consultants that worked for it. Bill Drake, and I don't remember Chenault's first name. And then in Dallas, there was Gordon McClendon, and they both came up with the top 40 idea, and that was short songs, short list of songs, playing them over and over. But they created stars and pop stars, and it was coinciding with the British invasion and the Beatles and all these songs of that era. By the 1970s, that loosened up a little bit, but not much. And now we had FM coming on the scene also. It was already out there, but it was relegated to hippie music and, large bands playing oboes,
Interesting.
And then, so the mid 1970s, album-oriented rock started on FM. And FM people started to notice, oh, it sounds cleaner. It's much better. And you don't lose it when you go under a tunnel or whatever it is, So that began to take over. And so by 1980, when I got into radio, I started at a top 40 station because I enjoyed that kind of music. I loved pop music. The radio station had to serve the public interest, the local public interest. In fact, you had to fill out paperwork and show that you were doing local advertising and meeting the local interest for X amount of hours a week. I can't remember, 6 hours a week, whatever it was. And there were rules also about who on a talk show. You had to give equal time to both sides.
And who was enforcing these rules?
The FCC, the Federal
FCC.
Communications Commission.
Okay.
And those things with the Reagan era, there was deregulation of a lot of these things. And so soon they also restricted you to how many radio stations and television stations you could own. They restricted you to, I think it was, seven. 7 FMs, 7 AMs, and fewer newspapers, and no more than 2 of any of them in any one market. But that began to be loosened up pretty soon after that. It was during the 1980s that you could own more stations. So what they started doing was programming them, and they'd have a name like Kiss or The Bear or whatever it was. And they'd program all these stations with the same songs and the same logo and the same contests and that kind of thing. And so what happened was stations, you didn't have to hold them for as long. You could sell them faster. So rather than the airtime selling commercials, that being the commodity, the radio station itself became the commodity. Soon, chains of stations became the commodity. And there was economy of scale when you were programming everything with the same one guy would have the ideas and just hand everything down, his edicts from the ivory tower someplace. And then so radio station chains became the product. And then in 1996, there was something called the Telecom Act that Congress pushed through. And what that was there were no more restrictions on how many stations you had, or you didn't have to hold them for very long. And so no longer was a station the commodity, certainly not the airtime on the station, certainly not even a chain of stations, but Yeah, well, the entire chain of stations, and so you could sell an entire company, and then small companies became bigger companies by gobbling mom and pops, and then those companies were swallowed by bigger fish still, and then we ended up with just a few players in any one town. I think here in San Diego we have maybe 3 or 4 different companies that own all the stations, and so where a guy like me could be on the air working and plying my craft and enjoying what I was doing. If they didn't like what I was doing at this particular station, well, then I'll just cross the street. I'll go over there and work for somebody else and make a deal with them and bring my audience with me. Well, now you got a company that, what are they doing? They're taking money out of one pocket and putting it in the other pocket.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make any economic sense for them to do that. And so what you have now is no economic incentive to win. And they've dumbed everything down. And where we were having maybe 7 stations in a chain of stations that were programmed by one guy, now you have maybe hundreds of stations programmed by a guy. And so there's a real monotony, and everything is sounding very much the same.
Interesting. And that's kind of where you ended up. And you mentioned that it was a syndication. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right?
Well, that's with radio stations itself. Along parallel to that, there was the idea of doing syndicated radio shows, and that would be whenever I would turn on my microphone, I'm talking to 100 stations at once. Not one. I was just one guy doing that. And the illusion was that I was in all these other little towns because I would punch a button that said it was my voice saying their local call letters, and it was 3 seconds long, and I would hear something in my headphones that would inform me. I would hear that 3 seconds of me saying something, and then I would begin saying my piece.
Really?
Yes. But because the illusion was I was in those little towns, that prevented me from being able to talk about what's going on in those towns.
Yeah.
Because now I've localized myself someplace. I can't talk about, for instance, when there's flooding in the Midwest. And we've got local stations that are having that problem. They're dealing with flooding. They're listening and they're going, why isn't this guy talking about the flooding? Well, because the people in Maine don't know anything about it, or Florida. That doesn't mean anything. There was a barge that had lodged itself on a sandbar outside Coos Bay, Oregon, where I had a station. And they were looking at ways to offload the oil, and they got as much of it off there as they could before the thing broke apart and spilled oil and fouled the entire coastline. And so they set this thing on fire after they got as much out of it as they could. So there's this thick column of smoke less than a mile offshore, and everybody in town is looking at it and oohing and awing. And I can't talk about it.
Interesting.
It hurt me. It was really, a problem.
So did those local stations wouldn't kind of cut the syndicated show off for that time and kind of say something special about, hey, here's what's happening locally? Because I remember, and the reason I ask is I didn't listen to a lot of FM, but I listened to a lot of AM. So it would be fun to explore this with you as well. But talk radio ended up very much on AM,
yes.
Right? And then FM was very much focused on like music,
yes.
if you wanted music. The station here in San Diego used to air national shows. They would air on a local station, but it was like a news station sort of. So at the breaks, you would hear local related things. So I could get like my traffic updates and things like that. So they have somebody sitting in the office here in San Diego who's looking at San Diego related things and talking about that. Was that not the case, or you were on the national side of it?
Yes. San Diego is a top 30 market now. It's maybe a top 20 market. Okay. So it's a big city, and you've got enough money in advertising to hire a big staff and keep them on standby or doing things that are local. Where if you're in Nebraska, you maybe have somebody that comes in the morning and does the farm report, talks about stock prices and pork bellies and whatnot. And then they maybe go home and they just flip on the bird, as they say, and let that do its thing. There might be a secretary, there might be somebody else that's hanging out just to make sure that, the wires nothing sparking, whatever, that kind of thing. So that's why in a smaller town, they may or may not have staff to do that kind of thing. And those jobs started going away. Fewer and fewer people were able to do them because they weren't being trained in these smaller towns. Like I started in a small town, as I mentioned at the beginning. I began by wearing a lot of different hats. Well, people don't get that opportunity anymore.
Right.
So I'm kind of a dinosaur.
So that's a good place, I think, to bring us full circle. It was super fascinating history of media. Take us now into the present.
Sure.
And it was like totally different.
Yes, it
like
is.
we got the internet, we got computers, we got cell phones, we got, these things in our pockets that are just ridiculous. They're
Magic.
like high-end cameras, audio, you got internet connection, you can broadcast anywhere. Like, tell us how we got there, and just the big media companies, and just how media has changed just completely.
2003, actually 2001, Apple invented the iPod, right?
Yes.
And that started a lot of things. So 2003, podcasts began. That is, somebody saw the wisdom of making programming that people could download from the internet, which was now getting faster. It was now at a point where there was broadband pretty widely available. You didn't have to have 56K dial-up to be able to get a big program down. Also, the algorithm MP3 played a big role in this, because that allowed files to be compressed to a size that it was acceptable quality, and it could be downloaded pretty quickly. Not quite streaming yet. The first thing I heard streaming, I remember going on and hearing a Christian artist named Clay Cross playing a song on the first media player online, was called Real Player.
I remember
Remember Real Player?
Yes,
and it sounded like he was singing it underwater.
Yeah.
It was just awful.
Okay.
It was really something. So we've come a long way, baby. So now by 2003, we're just beginning to have programs that you can download. And there were very few people that were interested in doing this. I actually had a friend from seminary that he was a very clever guy, very smart man, and a voiceover guy as well. He did sort of the same thing I do, but he was doing books and commercials and that kind of thing. And I said, we have such great rapport, why don't we do a podcast? He's, what's that? And so we went into his studio and sat down and just rapped about random things and riffed off of each other. And it was pretty entertaining. He goes, yeah, no one will ever want to hear that. People who continued doing that are now multimillionaires because they started, it was a boomer sooner land grab. And if we had done that, I might not be standing here talking to Andrew.
Yeah.
So I might send a proxy.
Yeah.
But
I'll send my servants.
Yeah. So that's when podcasting began, and how it began with Apple. And then other companies rose up. Spotify didn't really get into the podcasting game, which is where I worked for Spotify for a number of years. They got into the podcasting game in 2019. Maybe 2018. I think 2018 they began dabbling in it. 2019 they made a major investment, including purchasing a company that I was working for, producing podcasts. That is, we had a staff that wrote, researched, and we had narrators that would do stuff and read those scripts, and then I would take that raw stuff, edit it into a nice clean show, and put mood music under all of the different parts so that it would, captivate you and take you right through like a movie does.
Interesting. I guess this was right around the beginning of high school for me, when you're saying the iPod came out.
Yes. And
my first Apple product was an iPod Touch 4. Oh, wow. So I was super late to even adopt. I'm kind of a late technology adopter, although I have seen the value of getting at least one of the later phones, because we spend so much time with our phone now, and we still call it a phone. I don't know why, but the fact that people could pre-download music, and that was a huge thing.
Yes.
That, we ended up with these massive libraries of, like, we had a big library of CDs in our house. So I ripped the music onto my little, portable player, which was way better than like an old Walkman that you had to tape in,
Well, see, you were doing it right. You were ripping it in from CDs. There were other people that were ripping it off from online, from places like Pirate Bay and Napster.
What was it called? BitTorrenting or something like that?
BitTorrent,
where they would basically share
Right.
their music with their friends, which was meaning
Anybody.
anybody.
Which meant artists
Yeah.
didn't make money, which meant that the industry began to nosedive quickly.
Interesting.
It was
yeah.
a big problem for them. And in fact, that's the problem that Daniel Ek, the guy that founded Spotify, he was solving. His parents were musicians. He was a musician also, but also a technologist, and decided he wanted to make a way for the musicians to get paid for this brave new world of downloading so
Yeah.
that they weren't getting ripped off. It was obvious that downloading was going to be the wave of the future. There was no way around that. But how do you make it so that they can get paid? And so he devised this method of a subscription method through his app, Spotify, and different models. There's an advertising model for free. Anybody can listen to it. And then there's a premium that you can listen to, and you don't have
Like a
advertising,
subscription.
for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then he devised and had to negotiate with the record labels the amount of royalties that the artist would get. Now, it's not a lot of money, but it's more than they got they were getting from, say, Napster and like that. Here's how it works in radio. You think, well, radio's playing them for free also. What's the difference, right? Well, radio pays licensing fees to ASCAP, BMI, and in Canada it's called CSAC. These are different licensing companies, and they're for the artist, yes, mainly though for the composer. Whoever wrote the song, you'll see their name sometimes written on under the label, and those are the people that make the lion's share. The artist usually makes their money off of album sales, off the top, and from touring. And
you're saying
tchotchkes.
that's today. That's how
Even
it works.
still today,
Even
for radio, but for the online model, they get paid by this negotiated deal that Daniel Ek and his lawyers negotiated with the record companies.
Okay, so today, what would be the best or primary profit center then of a musician or an artist that's, producing music? Is it the royalties, or is it, or you're saying like physical album sales, like they still sell CDs?
They do, but not many. Because if you can stream it, why would you want to go to the store and buy it?
Yeah.
I noticed that the Rolling Stones recently put out an album. They are selling physical copies of it, but the streams of it are through the roof. And how much do you get paid for those songs? It depends really on lots of different things, but generally, as a rule of thumb, it works out to about 1/3 of a penny per play.
Interesting. Okay. And does it have to be like the whole song has to be played start to finish, or
30
if somebody,
seconds.
30 seconds minimum? Okay,
Right.
Interesting. So now take us all the way up to like what we're doing here.
Yes.
We're producing, this show right now. My wife and I produce it, and
do a great job, by the way.
Oh, well, thank you. Andy helped me set this all up. If you are wondering, if you look at the opportunity now, today, with the way, media platforms are, and maybe we can get into a little bit later, sort of what we call now big tech.
Yes.
Which is in many ways like replaced, I think, TV and radio.
Sure.
Like who actually turns on their radio now? But the radio stations had to adapt. But if you want to watch something, like for me, and maybe I'm dating myself or, giving some sort of indication of like where I am or who I am as a millennial, but I go to YouTube.
Yes.
Right? And there's like all kinds of stuff. Now, some of my favorite people and people that I really respect actually are not on YouTube anymore because they've been kicked off, which is a thing of itself.
Sure. Deplatformed.
Yes. But I really like what Vodi Bakum said at one point, like, hey, we're using these platforms that here are censoring people who are, giving, important truth. And his term was, he called it plundering the Egyptians. It's like plundering the Egyptians. So, obviously there's big agendas behind it. But before we go there, if we want to go there, we have the ability to produce a worldwide show, if you will. And I've seen downloads in other countries. I'm like, who in the world in Ireland is listening to the Whole Steward? This is super cool, And whoever you are, by the way, thank you. That's super cool.
Leave a comment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're able to produce a show right here.
Yes.
Right now, anybody is. So, tell us about that.
Well, the problem with it is, I call it the democratization of distribution. Because what we've done now is made it available. There's no gatekeeper. Used to be to get a hit song on the radio. Boy, the Beatles were turned down whenever they first tried to get a recording contract, for goodness sake. So there were gatekeepers that kept you from being able to distribute your stuff. Well, with the digital age and the democratization of distribution, anybody can do it. And so a lot of people who have no business distributing their stuff do. And so what do we end up with? If you flip on TikTok and that kind of thing, mindless, just brainless, just pabulum and horrible things that there's no quality control on a lot of that. And so here's the problem that we have now. Surfacing the good shows. What are the good ones that are new, that are doing a good job? It's an issue that you have with the Whole Steward and with many other programs as well that are likewise doing a good service, that are providing something for people, that really are taking pains to turn out a good product, but discovery is difficult. And it's difficult, by the way, on the part of big tech as well. It's a problem they work with all the time. Now, what gets surfaced? Well, it turns out squeaky wheel. And so DEI, CRT.
What do those mean? I don't even know what
diversity, equity, inclusion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, CRT, critical race theory.
Oh, right.
These various things.
Yeah.
Those squeaky wheels, they want to promote at a place like a Spotify, an Apple, or wherever your fine podcasts are hosted. Because if they don't, there's going to be ugly things written about them in the press, and they just want to avoid all that stuff. And so they elevate those voices. And oh, by the way, young people don't know any better because they've been taught this all their life. And so it just feeds itself. It's a monster eating its own tail.
So when you were at Spotify, you had the privilege to narrate the entire Bible.
I did, yes.
Genesis 1 all the way to Revelation.
Yes.
That was a Spotify exclusive, correct?
Yes, that's true.
So obviously not being a neutral company or environment, and you being a Christian in that environment. So how did that go? And then how did you end up doing this Bible narration podcast?
Well, let's back up a little bit and talk about that CRT thing, for instance. Okay. And the loud voices that were screaming within my company. The barbarians weren't at the gate. They were inside the gate. They were inside the company and shooting everybody they could, metaphorically. I want to make sure they would get that across. And they were, for instance, Joe Rogan. We had paid Joe Rogan $200 million for his show. Why? Because it's worth it. Because he guarantees a huge audience and big stories in the news. It drew a lot of attention to Spotify as a now podcasting platform.
That's the first time I had heard of Spotify when there was all that Joe Rogan controversy. I was like, I guess maybe I'd heard of it, but paid any attention whatsoever at all. Like I didn't have the app or anything.
People inside our company were like, why are you paying this guy all that money to say this stuff that they disagreed with? They didn't have any reason for disagreeing with it necessarily, but whatever their problem was, they voiced it loudly. And so Spotify appeased them by giving lots and lots and lots of shows to people that didn't really deserve them and doing just terrible things. And we hired, oh my goodness, we paid money to equal time. How about Michelle and Barack Obama? How about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle? They all got many, many millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars to do shows that frankly didn't draw in a minuscule audience, not anything comparable to Joe Rogan. But so anyway, that's beside the point. I'm inside the company now, and I'm doing. We have a solid slice. It's weird. One of the most popular podcast genres is true crime. And who do you think loves true crime? Is it men? No, women love true crime.
Okay.
Why? I
Right.
don't know why. It doesn't make any sense to me, but women apparently dig true crime.
How are they able to tell that? Like, did you have statistics on the back end?
Absolutely. We
you
can tell,
male,
how much
female?
you listen to, how old you are. All these things are granular. We know precisely how much.
Oh, that
and
just
when
makes
and
me
where.
feel great. Okay,
Well,
that's good. Yeah.
brave new world, my friend.
Yeah.
You got to kind of get used to that.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm on. I was very opposed to I didn't have Facebook. I did email,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a cell phone, and that was it. And I kind of gave up. I'm like, this is impossible.
Yeah, I contact friends by smoke signal.
Yeah.
So I'm doing these shows, true crime, and they are just mind-numbingly terrible stories. I mean, they're fascinating, but man's inhumanity to man is pretty well known, and we've had many millennia now to perfect our being cruel, and now it's entertainment. It's almost like the Colosseum back in the Roman days, and we're entertained by people doing terrible things and being scared by it. Horror movies, very big. So I'm kind of getting ill at doing that, but it's a job, and I'm doing it and that. And I had a one-on-one with my boss through the screen because I work for my home studio. And he was saying, hey, you've been doing such a good job on this. We want to kind of throw you a bone and let you do this simpler thing. It's very easy. And boy, you'll work 2 days a week and you'll be done. And that's just fine and everything. And I'm like, okay, what is it? He goes,
And what, you get to like be free the other 3 days?
Sure.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, because
Right.
you're working from home.
Yeah,
And
so
when you're finished and you've uploaded your stuff,
then you can go.
You're pretty well done. Yeah. And so I did that for a while, but I didn't do what he offered me was, here it is, horoscopes.
Aha.
And I'm like, I can't do horoscopes. I don't want to be disrespectful or insubordinate. I can't do horoscopes because I'm a Christian. And the Bible says we're not supposed to touch that at all. We leave that alone entirely. And my boss, I didn't know how he was going to respond to this. He was a guy a little older than me and very well known in our industry. He's just super respected. And I didn't know how he would respond. Here's how he responded. He said, I am so sorry. I hope you're not offended. We gotten to this point in our business life now where we're more concerned about, is the employee offended, than I told you you're going to be doing this thing.
Yeah. Get your job done.
Right? Exactly. Which is how I've always thought of it. And I didn't know how he would respond. That wasn't important to me. I'm more important to me is how God will respond.
Right.
So I told him that, and he goes, oh my, well, I've got an idea. We're looking at doing a podcast version of the Bible, splitting it into 365 parts and making it into a daily podcast. We'll call it the Daily Bible. Would you like to audition for that? And I'm like, yeah,
Yes, please.
Oh, that'd be great. And they told me initially, Andrew, that it was going to be the NIV. It was going to be just such a beautiful, the New International Version, such a sweet read that is. And then they found out, oh, that's not free. They didn't know.
Yeah.
They just, and by the way,
they had to look into it.
They didn't care Bible, schmibel. They just knew that, oh, there's a lot of people that'll be into this thing.
It's got to say BIBLE on the front, and then we can use it, unless it costs money.
Right. And so I did the King James version, but that was okay. It was fine. And so I got through the entire thing. And so while I'm doing the Bible, I won the audition right away. And we started doing that. That was during 2020. I did that all during COVID that year. That's what I was doing while we were all trapped in our homes. And I'm working in my studio here in San Diego. In Los Angeles, I've got, we call them line producers. So we had somebody, this job was to take the next chunk of text and just get it ready for me.
Right.
And somebody else would go through that text and look for heavy words or difficult pronunciations, all those names, all the different names that are in there that are difficult and different from anything we use. And they would spell them out for me phonetically. And then while I was reading it, they would be in my headphones correcting me. And I'm talking to them, they're hearing me, and I can hear them in my headphones.
Interesting.
And so they don't know the Bible. So as I'm reading through it, I had an opportunity to explain what it was I was reading. And they were fascinated. Now, I don't know what they did with that knowledge. I think they're pretty hardened pagans. I don't know. But they decided, whatever they decided, that's between them and God.
Right.
But I offered that information to them and you gave the gospel and like that.
So here you are sitting in Spotify.
Yes.
You were offered to do a podcast on horoscopes.
Yes.
Which was supposed to be easy, and you said, I can't do that.
Yes.
And they let you narrate, and you did the editing too, correct?
I did about 80% of it.
80%, okay.
Well, they thought they were throwing me a bone. I enjoyed doing that because there's music under it, and the music has tone and feel, and it really moves you through the pieces. But they thought, Andy's working so hard on this. Let's let somebody else do some of that editing also. And I let them, I'm like, okay, fine. That's, you're going to take a little weight off my shoulders. Fine. We have professionals that are doing this. But then I listened to a couple of the pieces and I'm like, this guy doesn't know the text. He's editing it poorly. There were places where there are curses. He's using light lilting music, and other places where there are blessings and he's using this dark, heavy music.
What in the world?
Yeah. So it didn't make any sense and it just sounded awful. So I took that back and did a lot of those.
And what do you mean you took it back? Did you tell your boss, like, hey,
I told my boss, thank
that?
you for doing that, but I prefer to do it myself. Can I? And absolutely, they trust me to do that.
So it's almost like nobody knew sort of the richness of what they were producing.
Truly.
And
it's just another book written by shepherds long ago. Probably had some bad meals and wrote down whatever they were thinking. That's what they were thinking.
But they're in it for the money, so they assume, hey, if we can get 15 million downloads.
They didn't know how many they would get.
Right. But
at this point, that's where it is. In fact, in the top 200 podcasts of all genres, for over a year, it was in the top 200. It got up, I think, as high as like 110 or 111, something like that.
Wow.
So not bad. And that's a lot of visibility. People were seeing it, trying it, enjoying it. It's got 4.9 stars, 2,000 ratings.
As much as people want to listen to these other shows,
yes,
they're also listening to the Daily Bible.
It's an option for them.
It's an option, but it's also being listened to.
Oh, yes.
15 million.
About 10,000 a day.
That's super cool.
Isn't that
amazing.
wonderful? Praise God.
Yeah. Yeah. Does it feel weird at all to have like that many ears listening to your voice? And I know like reading scripture is obviously the word of God, but
no, when I was doing that radio show on satellite on those 100 stations, had about 2 million listeners a week. So
I can't even wrap my head around that.
So it was really not a,
Did you ever get nervous or like just how did you get over that? Like when that red light or whatever it is turns on?
That's a very good question. And it happened in 1983. And I can remember when it happened. Might have been late 82 or early 83. And I went on the air and just bobbled and through a thing and messed it up entirely. And then I turned off the microphone and I went, oh my goodness, I'm such a fool. I can't believe I just did that like that. I know the phone's going to ring and people are going to tell me what an idiot I am. Well, the phone rang. The next person's just asking for a song. Then another person asked for a different song. Nobody mentioned it. So people hear a lot of that stuff the way maybe a dog hears their master, And I realized at that point, there's an old saying that says, don't worry what people think about you. They're not. They're thinking about themselves for the most part. And so I'm not so concerned about it. And I realized it's not like I got the top of somebody's skull open and I'm doing brain surgery. Lives don't hang in the balance. It's not that big of a deal.
Unless you
if I mess
offend
it up.
him while he's driving, like, and crash or something.
Well,
like
you
that.
can make somebody laugh so hard they get apoplectic.
And I think
hit a
you were
pole.
good at that. And you still do crack a lot of jokes. And I'm like, I gotta stop laughing here so we can get some work done. So that's kind of cool.
Well, thank you. Once I realized that it wasn't that important, I just let all that stuff go, and I went. I've always been funny, clever as a kid. I was around funny uncles and family, and I did impressions from the time I was a child, and that kind of thing. And I was bottling all that up and not letting that out. I was trying to be this cool guy on the air and not be me. Once I let that stuff go and started just flowing, just doing what it was I was thinking, and sadly letting some of the filter go that should have been there. But it was very successful. I did very well.
You were on air like every day, 5 days a week or more. So you were getting a lot of practice at it, but you found that you got better once you just started being you.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, once I stopped worrying about what everybody was thinking. And by the way, you're in a room really by yourself, you and a microphone. Maybe a couple of buddies are hanging out, or somebody, if you're there during the daytime, there might be office people popping in, popping out. But it's not that big of a deal. It's just folks that you're hanging out with, and really the people listening, likewise. It's not like they're sitting there with a scorecard judging every little thing you do.
Yeah. I guess maybe like nowadays we think about, okay, you've heard it called like the almighty YouTube algorithm, or you have a company like Spotify. I don't know if they're like, my podcast is available on Spotify.
Sure.
But I don't really know anything about how they promote it, or like how is it getting visibility or anything.
Do you
like
pay
that.
them to promote it? Then
No,
they
I
don't.
Okay.
That's how
okay. So the only way somebody's gonna find it then is if they actually search
That's
the
right.
Whole Steward.
So it's
or
on
somebody sends them
you
a
to
link or
do
something.
your own promotion.
Right.
You have to do social media. You have to let people know. You go on other shows. They come on your show. There's a good way to go. One hand washes the other.
So help me understand this. They're paying somebody like Joe Rogan
Yes.
$100 million. I
Yes.
think you said
200
$200 million
for 3 years.
for 3 years, and then there's all these other shows that you're saying if they want to even be promoted or heard or anything, like they have to pay. So
Yes.
there's like some people that Spotify is paying,
Yes.
and there's other people who Spotify is getting paid.
On the nose.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
That's how it works. Because he already came with an audience. He's a known quantity. He's an actor, a comedian, an MMA artist, or mixed martial artist. So he's a well-known person. They were buying audience.
I see. I thought it'd be interesting. We have just a little bit of time left to talk about how to start a podcast, just briefly, and then kind of tell us about what you're doing now. So we heard a lot of history, and I think it would be interesting to hear. So
Sure. So if you wanted to start a podcast, first off, what's your motivation for doing it? Why do you want to start a podcast? What would be your point of doing that? Is it to get adoration of fans? There are probably better ways to do that. Is it to make money? There might be better ways, or maybe not. Do you have an idea? What's the core and crumb of your idea for making a podcast? Do you have a viable plan? Start with that. What are people looking for? Is there something you're good at or you like doing? Scratch your own itch first, because if you like it and you want to do it, it might be that there's a lot of people just like you. There's a great article. It's called 1,000 True Believers by Kevin Kelly. And the idea in Kelley, if you want to Google it, it's easy to find, because it's set the mark for this whole idea of getting fans online. This is a seminal work, 1,000 True Believers. And it's not a long read. There's a longer read and a shorter one of the same thing. But the idea is this. There's a number. 1,000 is a number he uses. But let's say you're a local musician. Let's say you want to make money playing your guitar and singing your songs. There's a number of people you need to support you in doing that. How many is that, and how much do you need to get from them each year to make your yearly money from them? And that's all there really is to it. Then you make your product for those people. Now, there's the fat part of the curve where you got I'm not current, so I'll go old school, Michael Jackson and Madonna, people like that. Way up there, a lot of people listening to that. And then those are popular for a while, and there's a slope that goes out. And this is called the long tail. When it gets out there, there's fewer and fewer people. And pretty soon you get out there where there's left-handed Lithuanian nun folk music, right? And so, but there's going to be people that are into left-handed Lithuanian nun folk music. They're going to be super dedicated to it. And when they find you, they go, these are my people. And they will catch every show. They will buy the t-shirt. They'll buy tickets to the live show. They'll, get the latest album. They'll do whatever it is. They're super fans. Are there enough of those? How many are there? How do you reach them? There's usually some silos you can advertise to find those people. How much do you need to make from each of them to make a viable living? That's the basic idea of 1,000 True Fans.
Interesting. And now we have things like there's a thing called locals, and then the other one, it's where you give. The name is escaping me now.
Patreon.
That's the one. Yeah.
Sure.
And there's people that I appreciate and watch, and they're always talking about, if you like what I do, support me on Patreon, and that's how I bring you more and all that stuff. And
yes, my wife's blog has a buy me a coffee button.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. There you go.
That's darcydishes.com.
Yeah, good.
Take advantage.
That's super cool. Yeah, you have this opportunity, if you will, with the way media is now for really anybody to do it. And I heard somebody say, and I forget who said it, and I wish I could remember, but it was on a podcast of all things. And he was saying, you should be podcasting, even if there's an audience of one. Now, of course, you and I know that our audience of one is God alone, and what we do is obviously defined by everything that we believe in according to Scripture and worship to God. But the audience of one he was referring to was yourself. So you may be articulating ideas, thinking about life, whatever the topic is that you're thinking about, you're articulating that as a podcast, let's say, and it's sort of a way to validate even with yourself your ideas, and then maybe otherwise.
That can be dangerous.
What do you think about that?
That can be dangerous because you're in front of, and now it's preserved, and as they say, once it's on the internet, it's forever.
Okay.
And so if you're thinking out loud, sometimes some thoughts don't need to be said out loud, and so you need to be careful about that. But what you can do, rather than making money or getting the adoration, maybe you just want to increase your authority, or maybe you're doing something like a book and you want to put some extra focus on that, or maybe you just have this itch that you want to scratch. You want to do a research project, or there's somebody that you want to reach out to and talk to them. Maybe you're a fan of Elon Musk. Let's just throw a name out there. And so you maybe wanted to find an angle and do a show about AI, for instance, because most recently that's his most recent thing that he's fascinated by, his most current shiny object that he's into. And so you maybe find a way to reach him like that, or just whoever it is, other people that are in that realm. So you can increase your authority in your business. You can set yourself up in that way.
Yeah, interesting. I do know some businesses that I work with and do business with that really have nothing to do with like media production, other than they have a podcast about what they do on a daily basis, which their business is completely unrelated to media, but...
A friend of mine that was a program director in Los Angeles has a company now that is called Sound That Brands. One of his clients, Trader Joe's, a podcast for Trader Joe's. You're thinking, what? Why would
I had no idea.
Why would Trader Joe's need a podcast? Well, they've done almost 70 of them at this point, and they're fascinating. And they're just things about what's behind the scenes. What do the bells mean? How did the orange chicken get into Trader Joe's? Just fascinating stories about Trader Joe's. Why do they wear those Hawaiian shirts? Why do they do things the way they do? Their culture is very interesting. That's about a brand. There are lots of these for various brands, and anybody doing a business. I was looking the other day through a mailer I got in my mailbox, right? Because that's where mailers go to the mailbox.
Okay.
So, but I'm looking at there and I'm thinking, how much do they spend on this full page color glossy spread for something that is for a guy that's doing landscaping stuff? And his stuff was really good and everything. But what if he did a podcast instead? He could do that for what they spent on that mailer. And now they can talk about what are the best materials, what time of year, what side of the house should it be on, what plants go in what areas, what is your zone. They can talk about all the various things that go into that. I'm just off the top of my head doing that, obviously.
Right. Some of my favorite YouTube channels actually are business guys talking about their business. And since I'm, super fascinated by business in general, for example, there's a guy on YouTube who just goes into everything pressure washing. He's got a pressure washing business.
Wow.
And he shows you how to do it. Here's how you do it. Here's the tools. Here's how you could get started. Here's all this stuff.
Now, if you lived in that town where he was and you needed something pressure washed, who are you going to call? You might
I know all about what he does. I can see it every day.
You might do it yourself, or you might hire the expert to come out and do it.
So if you have a business or something that you enjoy doing, or something you're saying that it's a podcasting now is a great avenue, and it's accessible to anybody.
Sure,
it's easy. I mean, I do a fair bit of preparation, but for the Whole Steward, but somebody doesn't necessarily have to do, all of that preparation, right?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish and who you're trying to reach, who your audience is, where you're going to distribute it, all those various things. You're doing video and audio, both of which are excellent. Somebody might choose to do just audio or just video. And so it just depends on what you want to do. But I would recommend, and that's why I built, to talk about my business a little bit. podcastaxis.com. It's podcast AXIS, as in the center of things, that everything's connected to it. That's why I call myself the hub of Podcast Axis. And at my website, you can find all kinds of articles on how to do this, how to think about putting together a podcast, so that almost anybody, what I want really people to be able to do is go there, see it, and do it for themselves. Or I can help you through the process also. That's going to cost you some money, but not a lot. And but honestly, even people that are clients, I would like for them to grow to a point where they can do it themselves.
Interesting.
That's my goal.
Cool. So that's how people can reach you, is podcastaxis.com.
That's correct.
I really appreciate you spending the time to come and share it. Awesome history of media. I find it super fascinating. Like I said, I avoided social media in particular, and this stuff gets all over social media because I finally gave up and thought, for me, it was a way to reach more people with the things that I was learning, and I said, I want to learn more as well. So this has been an awesome learning experience. I can say that for sure. Well,
what I want to do, since Spotify cut back on their podcast department and got rid of a couple of hundred people, one of which I was one of those people this year. Yep. That's why I devised
the secure job. There you go.
There's no such thing.
Yeah.
That's why I devised Podcast Axis, so that I can be a whole steward with the knowledge God has entrusted to me and poured into me over decades. I can pour that into other people also and help them accomplish what they want to do.
Yeah, and I'm certainly grateful for all the tips that I've gotten from you on the Whole Steward, and really grateful for, again, just the great learning experience, the history, and I hope you found this helpful, how you can start a podcast if you want to. There's certainly plenty of resources out there, but Andy is one of the best. So thank you very much, Andy, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Well, God bless you. Thank you for asking me. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been great. So take care. Wow, what a great conversation. Thank you very much to Andy Waits for coming on today, giving us a perspective that is unique in being so involved in cutting edge forms of media all throughout his life and living his Christian values in a world that promotes frankly, very false and damaging ideology and lies and propaganda. Now, you might say, well, the Christian worldview promotes lies and propaganda too. Now, that is between you and the Lord, because what Scripture says is truth is true. It's very difficult to argue with the wisdom that comes from above. Scripture says it is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. You need the Lord to open your heart to that truth, to embrace it and not put it away. Andy certainly lived out his faith, even within a company like Spotify, and was blessed by the Lord to then articulate with his tongue the entire Bible. How awesome is it that those words of truth could be broadcast on these modern forms and platforms of media? Now, the other thing that he talked about was your voice, the ability for you to maybe start a podcast or to write in a blog or to write a book. We need more truth being said and not less. There's a lot of noise out there. And if we shell up as believers and we do not speak the truth in love, then we will allow those with louder voices to completely saturate and control the narratives and the platforms of media. We need to fight for what is true, but we need to do it in a spirit of wisdom, and that wisdom which comes from above, as we saw in James chapter 3. If you liked the show or found it helpful, please let me know. I will read and respond to your comments. You can contact me either through our website or letters@thewholesteward.com. You can leave a comment on the platform that you're listening on. That will really help out the Whole Steward. Until next week, now that you know more, go out and grow more.
All content on The Whole Steward is for informational purposes only and must not be considered personal, professional, tax, or legal advice. Please consult an appropriate professional for individualized advice. Though we do our best to bring you reliable information, we make no guarantee on its accuracy, so you must rely on your own due diligence to draw your own conclusions. The views expressed by guests on the show are their own and may not represent that of the host. Please visit our website for complete terms and conditions.
Thanks for joining us today for the holistic approach to wealth from a Christian worldview. This show is brought to you by thewholesteward.com.